Okay, let's make a start, because with 1 hour, or 50 minutes, of course, we have limited time, and we've got two things to do today. Firstly, I want to finish our very brief survey of the politics of pre-Viking Britain, with reference to kind of very northern England and what is now Scotland, and say a little bit about what was going on there very, very briefly. You could run a whole course on each of these areas, of course, so we're touching upon these things very, very basically. And then, I hope, you have all read those chapters from the first book of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, and we'll chat a little bit about those, particularly with reference to the process of conversion of the pagan Anglo-Saxons, or that refers particularly to the conversion of Athelbert in Kent, of course, but we can get some other points from there as well, I hope. Right, so what is now called Scotland, what's the Turkish again? Iskoçya, okay, which is kind of roughly north of here. We can only really begin referring to the concept of Scotland as such by the 10th century. Before that, we have a series of shifting and fluctuating kingdoms and peoples, okay, and only in the 10th century and later can we really accurately say this is Scotland, okay, or as it's sometimes called, Alba or Albu and so on, as a sort of separate and fairly fixed entity. Firstly, a few words about the element Scot, because that's confusing. The name Scotland means the land of the Scots, of course, but the Scots originally came from Ireland. Scotti, the Scots in medieval Latin, was a word used to refer to, one of the words used to refer to the Irish, okay? And as we're going to see briefly today, and hopefully a bit more later on in a few weeks' time, at some point in the very late Roman period or whatever, or perhaps earlier, people argue these things, some people from Ireland, from this region called Ulster in the north, had settled in the Scottish Isles round here, and it's during the early Middle Ages that the gradual spread of this kingdom to the creation in the 10th century of the kingdom of the Scots happens, okay? So not only, bless you, Chucky, actually that was a loud one, we probably picked it up on the microphone then. Only with the spread of the power of these Irish immigrants politically do we get the concept of Scotland correctly, of course. We can refer to geographically what's now Scotland, as I keep saying, but originally this area was the land of the Scots, and then slowly they expand at the expense of the Picts and the Dalriatans and others, and then in the 10th century we get something which we can properly call Scotland as a separate kingdom or whatever. So there's a certain level of confusion. We get that in the sources. When we see Scot or something, does it mean an Irish person, or does it mean someone from what is or becomes Scotland? So there's a certain amount of confusion about that. Of course, just to remind ourselves, during the Roman period, Scotland and part of northern England as well was not under direct Roman influence. We have the governor Agricola having some success in the north of Scotland, but that was very, very short-lived. And then we have, of course, Hadrian's Wall, and briefly a bit later Antonine Wall, but going back to Hadrian's Wall, as we've discussed before, as the effective border between Britain, Roman Britain, and non-Roman Britain in the north. So in terms of looking at Scotland is a continuity, of course. The Roman aspect provides a kind of breaking point in that sense. But gradually, in the post-Roman period, we see the incorporation of what is now Scotland into the broader Christian and post-Roman cultural world, which becomes Britain. I've got two maps here to show the main divisions that we're going to be looking at. Okay, this is the very northern England and southern Scotland. Here we see the two walls marked as well for convenience purposes. So what we might call here southern Scotland, between the two walls, okay, has two main linguistic divisions in terms of the political entities. We've already seen that what had probably been a British kingdom, Bernicia, has become controlled from Bamborough by the arriving Angles, and that history of that area is tied in with Deira. We talked about that last time, and much of the post-Roman period we see the gradual expansion of these Northumbrian regions this way and that way. Okay. In addition to these English kingdoms, however, also in the north, as these had been originally, we see British or Brittonic kingdoms. So firstly the English ones, and we've talked about that already, and now we'll say a little bit about some of these British kingdoms as well. A number of kingdoms seem to emerge in the post-Roman period, again just as we see elsewhere, as a localization of culture and politics and so on, okay, but in this area that had been previously largely outside direct Roman influence. We'll say a little bit about three kingdoms in particular: Strathclyde, Gododin, double D in Welsh, spelt the, and then Rheged, which probably reaching across this way into what is Cumbria in northern England as well. So the peoples of these areas, and also here before the English arrive, were cousins of the Welsh, so they were British or Brittonic, and sometimes we talk about, we don't know much about their form of the P-Celtic, but no, what am I doing? Cumbric, okay, is sometimes used to refer to their branch of the Celtic language, okay, and we have some references, names, and a few poems which may or may not be locatable in this general region. By far the most long-lasting of these British kingdoms was the kingdom of Strathclyde, and if you can't see that, that's as it is in modern kind of anglicised spelling, and it was probably for a long time based at the fortress at Dumbarton. That kingdom, in one form or another, continues throughout the early Middle Ages. Perhaps during the 10th century, the kingdom of the Scots begins to extend its influence more and more in Strathclyde, but some kind of political existence probably continues down until the 11th century. Okay, so until the 11th century, we have a situation where we have English over here, gradually the expansion of the Gaelic-speaking Scots here, but something which we can call Strathclyde, but losing its power in this region as well. To the east of Strathclyde, the kingdom of Gododin, I'll write that one up as well, which may have kind of spread a bit further down here as well, perhaps, and so on.
Does that name also derive from like Woden or Odin, like this?
No. That has origins in a tribal name from the Roman period and so on. So there's no, it sounds a bit similar, but no, nice try, but nothing to do with Odin or something like that. Okay. This kingdom disappears quite early on. It came once Bernicia had been taken over by the Angles. Obviously there was a strong, or not so strong, but growing English presence on the borders of Gododin and pushing northwards towards Gododin. And probably by the early 7th century, okay, we see the end of this kingdom. There is a poem in Old Welsh which refers to a battle between the men of Gododin and the English probably at a place which is now called Catterick. I don't know if it's on this map or not. Okay, it's just down here. Okay, an attempt by the men of Gododin to attack the English down there in northern Yorkshire. They get defeated, kind of slaughtered in effect. And then within a few years, this battle may have happened around about 600. And then within a few years of that, it seems that the Northumbrians were able to absorb this area, which includes, of course, Edinburgh, capital now. And this region, particularly up here, which is called Lothian, okay, stayed under English control until 10th century, if I recall, or 11th century. There are various documents suggesting the shift of this area to the Scots by that point. So this is the gradually spreading English influence in northern England and southern parts of Scotland, okay, here remaining fairly Brittonic. And lastly, the kingdom of Rheged, which also disappears fairly early on. We have a few references, but probably during the 7th, or at least definitely by the early 8th century, this British kingdom around here had been again taken over by the Northumbrians and so on. So only here in Strathclyde do we see some political continuation of the British tradition. Of course, the British language, Cumbric or whatever we want to call it, was still spoken in these parts of northern England and southern Scotland for a lot longer perhaps than political independence, but gradually giving way to English and perhaps up here to Gaelic as well. Okay, jumping north of the walls, north of the Antonine Wall, we have, I don't know how clear that is, we have two main entities here. First is I've kind of marked with this pen these areas here. We have these settlers from the Northern Irish region called the Ullath, which is Ulster in modern nomenclature. And these Scottish islands round about here settled perhaps quite early by people from Northern Ireland, but we get the emergence of a number of, particularly 3 important clans or family groups, small kingdoms, which eventually coalesce and become the kingdom of Dal Riata, which sometimes is spelt as one word, Dal Riada, things like that, various combinations of this. And Dal Riata was also a name of a kingdom in Ullath, in Ulster in Ireland, but exactly how they're connected and on is hard to be certain, okay? And these groups eventually forming and taking over parts of the mainland, and as we said, basically the story is the gradual expansion of this kingdom, both eastwards and to some extent southwards as well, and obviously northwards, to create in the 10th century the kingdom of Alba, or Scotland, as we call it. The people of the sort of main part of northern Scotland, here marked by the blue, are the guys that we've talked about briefly before a few weeks ago, the Picts, allegedly the people who've got pictures, drawings on their skin and so on. They are probably the heirs, the descendants of the Caledonians and other northern tribes that the Romans mentioned and were so concerned with and so on, okay? But the Picts are very interesting because they're kind of, or they have been until more recently, quite controversial. For a long time, it was not clear even what language the Picts spoke. We have some references in terms of personal names and place names and a few kind of strange inscriptions and so on. And for example, 100 years ago or more, some linguists and Celticists thought that the Picts were somehow non-Indo-European. They tried to show connections between what they called the Pictish language and perhaps something like Basque, another one of these non-Indo-European languages which we're quite happy to identify as such, but in France and Spain. Now people say that the Picts were definitely Celtic, or at least their language, we should say, was Celtic, and probably it was related to the P-Celtic languages of Strathclyde and Godolphin and so on. It's just another form of British or Brittonic Celtic, but further north. But we don't have a lot of documents. We can't analyse it in great detail. In addition, we can look at the area of the Picts. We find a series of what are sometimes called Pictish symbol stones. This is one quite famous one, so let's put Pictish symbol stones. And exactly what the images, often very abstract images, and other things on the stones were meant to do was not very clear to scholars. Okay, and they're very characteristic of this region. Again, seem to make the Picts seem to be, one way or another, rather different from their neighbours elsewhere in Scotland and beyond. Some people think that the images reflect maybe tribal groups or something like that. Some of them are thought to represent maybe some kind of language or attempt at an alphabet. That's debated, I think, these days. But again, whatever the meaning of these stones, some of them have more obvious Christian character, some of them perhaps less. They do show a cultural difference, if not a kind of ethnic difference from elsewhere. And lastly, it was been argued, and I think some people still believe this, that the kings of the Picts inherited their kingship matrilineally, that they had matrilineal kingship. What would that mean?
They follow the mother's line.
Yes, that a guy would become king not through the blood of his father, not from father to son, but through his mother. Okay.
Native Americans.
Sorry?
Most Native American tribes were matrilineal.
Right, I see. Okay. Well, that, yeah, probably there have been comparisons and things like that. Now, and some very early documents don't quite state this, but they seem to give some important role to the female connection, and then scholars have put various things together and tried to reconstruct the king trees and so on, and are very uncertain about it. Probably what was going on is that what we sometimes call Pictland was in fact a series of, traditionally referred to 7 kingdoms or provinces, which I've marked out here. We won't go into all their names, but some places still surviving. Caithness up here, and Fife down here, and so on, in Scottish names, and Atholl today as well. And maybe these were a number of kingdoms or sub-kingdoms ruled by their own families, and then one of the lines, often from Fortescue particularly, may have been very powerful and acted as a kind of over-king and controlled the others to varying degrees. And so the reason we can't reconstruct the relationship between the different kings in the documents is they often were not necessarily related. They had different fathers but also different mothers and things like that. So politically, again, we're not sure exactly, but personally, I've always been against this idea. It just seems too kind of crazy to accept for an early medieval context, and there must be some kind of other explanation. It's not saying that power is not transmitted matrilineally in some societies, as Jenkins says, but that in this case, particularly for kingship, rather than just inheritance, it seems a bit extreme, so there must be something else going on. So for many years, the Picts seen as somehow different, and even regarded as perhaps different from, ethnically from the other people of northern Britain, but now we generally accept that they were just slightly isolated, and perhaps because of the lack of Roman influence, separate British Celtic people who eventually by the 10th century become replaced. We get the kingdom of the Scots and the Picts in the 10th century being replaced politically by the Irish settlers down there in the Isles as they expand. Okay, that's very, very briefly my survey of early medieval Scottish history. Any questions? Anything you wish to ask about that? No? Okay. Get your copies of Bede, and let's have a read of Bede. Can anyone remember anything about the Venerable Bede, or Venomous Bede as he's sometimes called? What have I said a little bit about him before?
I know that Bede was monk, was called, and he lived in 7th century.
Yes, he would have lived from the late 7th into the early 8th century, yeah. And he lived...
Was kind of the ruin of Britain, of course, Latin.
that's Gildas, the ruin of Britain. De Excidio Britannia. This is, Bede's book was the ecclesiastical history of the English and so on, okay. But he does draw upon Gildas amongst other sources. I put the wrong map up before. Yes, Bede was a monk who spent the large part of his life in a monastery in the north of England in Northumbria. He was an Englishman, therefore, or regarded himself as an Englishman or an Angle, therefore different from the Welsh and the Scots and so on, and also different from the West Saxons, who were a long way away from his world and so on. He is the first English historian, if we talk about English meaning Anglo-Saxon, okay, and even someone like Gildas, we would not, who wrote earlier, we would not call him English, we wouldn't really call him an historian anyway. He wrote a number of works, many of them obviously religious in nature, and even his history is a religious history, and he's most famous for his history. That's what he's well known for. What we'll do now is look at how he describes the conversion of the English, which doesn't mean all the English by any means, the process and perhaps some of the techniques and problems there. We might expand a little bit beyond what he says. And so as a preface to that, it's worth reminding ourselves that in addition to the political geography that we've been looking at so far, the other important factor in the cultural development of the British Isles, Britain and Ireland, during this period was Christianity. Okay? It was a part connected to the Roman past, and it was the main vehicle through which Romano-Greco culture and learning and literacy and everything else were transmitted, okay, and provided a focus for people's activities and lives throughout the Middle Ages and things like that. So as I've said before, we shouldn't think in a kind of limiting secular or laistic way and say, you know, Middle Ages were dominated by priests and they were very bad and they restricted people's ability to learn and do things or whatever. Okay, that's imposing our own views on the world and so on. We have to look at what was going on and why and so on from the context of the Middle Ages itself, and obviously Christianity, independent of our belief in ourselves, was a very important aspect of the Middle Ages. You could see negative or positive. We're not going to add value judgments and so on. So for the English proper, which doesn't mean the British, but for the English proper, okay, Bede here is telling us the arrival of Christianity as he learned it and as he was able to reconstruct it from various sources. Okay, tell me a little bit about how he does this. What are his techniques? What kind of history is he doing here? We've talked about Gildas. Gildas clearly had a very, very kind of limited amount of information he gives us, using it for a particular purpose and so on, which is as a kind of sermon. We've looked at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is an attempt to give very specific dates to brief events reaching back. How could we classify Bede's kind of the characteristic of what he's writing and what he's trying to write, his purpose? What's your impression of this book? All the bits we've read, the 10 chapters or so.
Letters from either between Augustine and Pope, so it obviously has a very religious aspect, and he leaves out anything else. It doesn't really have. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a history of the people necessarily.
Well, this bit, obviously, the reason I've chosen it is because it's the religious bit. I mean, he does talk about politics, and I think chapter 34, which is more of a political one, is kind of stuck there at the end, because it's the end of that book as we now divide Bede's work up. But you mentioned the letters, and this is quite an important bit. I mean, here he is, he's not just saying this happened, he's actually quoting, and he believes quoting faithfully, I think, the text of letters written by the Pope, Pope Gregory, to Augustine and other people during this period. I mean, he's a good historian in that sense. He's citing his sources, he's quoting his sources, he's not just making it up as he goes along, but he's obviously using it in a certain way and so on. So,
at this time in Europe, how much influence does the Pope actually hold? I mean, it's coming out of the collapse of the Roman Empire, I mean, like over separate kingdoms, I would say. Well,
very limited power, obviously. You can't compare Pope Gregory I even with one of his great successors, Pope Gregory VII, later on in the Middle Ages, and certainly not with a modern pope as father of the Catholics throughout the world or something like that, obviously because of the physical limitations in the Middle Ages of communication and things like that. It would have been a very different world. Also, the papacy itself had been undergoing, it was in the process of kind of organising itself and setting itself up and reasserting its power within the religious sphere over a number of generations, and Gregory was one of the important popes that helped to establish the primacy of the papacy and so on, which a couple of hundred years earlier could have been challenged. So, yeah, I mean, he's a father figure, and he's obviously, through his letters, trying to assert some authority, but he has no direct control over what's going on in the ground in Kent or in Northumbria or anything at that point directly, okay, but indirectly through his missionaries and things. So yes, it's a religious work, and it has a very clear purpose, and we're looking at the religious bit, or one of the important religious bits of the book, so quite important. I think it's the opening chapter I asked you to look at, chapter 22, and I can't remember the criteria for choosing why we start here. Here we're dealing with the period of fluctuation between the British and the Anglo-Saxon arrivals in Britain and so on. And the British have some success. There's a brief period of peace during the wars between the Anglo-Saxon arrivals and the British, and then he's talking about that. And perhaps for him and for us as well, he briefly mentions Gildas, but then after that, what does he say? A very important point, okay, that he makes with reference to the English in relation to Christianity, or the British in relation to Christianity, in chapter 22. I've got the translation here, I haven't got the one from the web. They're going to be similar, but not exactly the same wording. But he says, in my translation, among the unspeakable crimes recorded with sorrow by their own historian, they, okay, the British people, added this, that they never preached the faith, Christianity, to the Saxons or Angles who dwelt with them in Britain. Okay, and this is one of his big issues, that we've got all these pagan Anglo-Saxons coming in to Britain and settling and fighting to some extent with the British, but then we have a peaceful period, and he says the British, who are Christian, the Welsh, or whatever you want to call them, in the south and the British in the north, they never made an attempt to convert the Angles and the Saxons to Christianity, to bring them on board, to incorporate them. They kept away from them, they fought with them or kept separate from them. They didn't try to spread the faith as good Christians perhaps should have done. And of course he's a Christian Englishman, so this failure of the British to convert the English was seen obviously as a bad point, as something, certainly one of their big crimes in his view. Gildas doesn't mention that, of course, but for Bede it's very important. So from the start of this section, where he's coming to conversion, he's building up to it, he's saying the British failed, and so something else has to happen, some other process to bring the English into the Christian world has to happen, because the British deliberately failed to do that. So what happens? How do the English, or some of the English, become Christian? What's the process? Sorry?
He mentions about divine inspiration at some point, and also in the later this marriage of the king.
Right.
With a Christian.
Right. Which king?
Augustine.
Augustine is...
No, Augustine preaches is it Ethelbert?
Sorry? Go on, Marta. Bertha? Who is Bertha then? Okay, let's... We mentioned this last week. I drew it up on the board. We can ask Emre to show us the file or something if you want. Who is Bertha? Bertha. She was a Frankish princess. Okay, her father was king or ruler around Paris or whatever. And She's married, she becomes married to whom? Ethelbert. Various spellings of that, but that's the kind of one, the more Anglo-Saxon or Old Englishy spelling, I suppose we could say, okay? So, we have Ethelbert, a pagan king, where? Which kingdom? Where is he? Kent. Yeah, okay, which is the closest bit to northern Gaul, to Francia, being married to a Christian foreign Yabanja wife, okay, who continues to practice her religion, and he continues to be pagan, but they formed an alliance, a connection between the southern English and the northern Franks and so on. Okay, that's one point. But how does, she's not the one that converts him to Christianity. How does he become Christian? Though the fact that he's married to Bertha must be important. What's the process that leads to the conversion here?
Augustine's mission sent by Pope Gregory. So Augustine, I think it mentions in chapter 23 about how at first Augustine is kind of weary about going because of the distance, the danger between the encounter, but the Pope kind of strengthens him with some religious resolve and is like, have faith in God, go do it anyway. So him and I think, doesn't he send some monks with him?
Yeah.
They go and then give some gifts and show them what Christianity can offer, I guess.
Yes, there's this bit is very briefly sketched, but later on, I think it's the first book in chapter in book 2, if I can find this bit here, where he's telling about the death of Gregory. Okay, Bede also tells us how Pope Gregory, this is a kind of origin legend, a myth, I suppose, up to a point. Okay, he says, we are told one day, this is in Rome, okay, we're talking about Pope Gregory, some merchants who had recently arrived in Rome displayed their many wares, their many goods, their things in the marketplace. Among the crowd who thronged to buy was Gregory, who saw among other merchandise some boys exposed for sale, slaves, okay. These had fair complexions, fine-cut features, and beautiful hair. Looking at them with interest, remember he's Italian guy, so like you Turks, dark-haired Mediterranean or something like that, okay. He inquired from what country and what part of the world they came from. They have come from the island of Britain, he was told, where all the people have this appearance. He then asked whether the islanders were Christian or whether they were still ignorant heathens. They are pagans, he was informed. Alas, said Gregory with a heartfelt sigh. Alas. How sad that such bright-faced folk are still in the grasp of the author of darkness, that's the devil, and such graceful features conceal minds void of God's grace. What is the name of this race? They are called Angles, he was told. And that is appropriate, he said, for they have angelic faces. Okay, blah, 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 blah. The joke here, as it's come down to us in Latin, is he's meant to have said, non Angli said Angeli. Not English, but angels, okay, because of their white faces, white skin and white hair and so on. And as I said, being dark-skinned and dark-haired, Mediterranean, presumably, there was a great contrast between these people. So then he decides we must bring these people, these angelic English, into God's world and so on. And then they launch this mission, as Cengiz was describing. Yes, and that first chapter we look at has this bit where the guys are kind of a bit uncertain which way to go, and then I think Augustine goes back and Gregory says, no, 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 you stupid boy, go back and finish it, don't stop halfway through and things, and he goes, sorry guys, we've got to carry on. And so then they end up arriving in Kent and so on. They arrive at Thanet, the island of Thanet in the Thames, we are told, and whether by chance or deliberately, they come to Kent where Ethelbert already has this Christian wife. And what's Ethelbert's reaction? What's his reaction to these Christians, these monks?
I wasn't able to come didn't at first, I mean, he wasn't hostile to him, obviously, but he didn't convert right away.
No, he's a bit wary at first. He lets them settle eventually. He says, don't do anything until I've got some kind of, we meet up, and he doesn't want to meet them where they can influence him and so on. But then they get together, and he says, okay, you can settle here. You can obviously look after my wife. She's been going to this ruined church, whatever, what state it was in Canterbury, what's now Canterbury. I'm not going to become a Christian myself. I'll carry on, but you can, if you want, you can preach your faith. Okay.
Yeah, it said something about a license to preach.
Yes. So yeah, for a while they settle down and they're preaching, and obviously looking after Bertha and her entourage, the Franks presumably who are with her, and they're quite happy to have some kind of a bishop. Augustine gets the pallium, becomes a bishop shortly afterwards once he's there and so on. And then after a while, Ethelbert himself decides to convert. Okay, he becomes Christian, which obviously is a very important point. Okay, his conversion is important. But he does say, I'll become Christian, but I don't want you to force other people to convert, okay? I'm Christian and other Kentish men are now Christian, but you can't go around forcing others to become Christian. If they want to stay pagan, as I was until recently, that's fine, okay? What else have we got here then? What else do we have? Depends how many of you have read this and how far you got.
There was something about how, if Augustine sent a letter to Gregory, but it tells him to follow the doctrine of the primitive church.
Well, okay, there's a long section where we have a long letter. We won't go into that. A long letter where Augustine asks a number of questions to Gregory and gets these sometimes quite detailed kind of theological and practical replies about who can marry whom and all these other things and the nature of the church and the relationship between the churches and so on. One important point is that Gregory says when we get more bishops in Britain, okay, or I suppose I'm not sure what he's thinking about here, because presumably there were already people in Wales and elsewhere who had called themselves bishops, but he's thinking perhaps of the English. When you have other bishops, you will be their boss, okay, you will be the primate over them. Canterbury, he's setting up Canterbury as the main, what we now call archiepiscopal church. So that's an important point. Later on, we have a series of other letters and so on, okay, including one where he's saying we need a bishop in London, we also need someone up in York, and these guys will have kind of varying influence and so on over each other or whatever. And then there's a very important one, let me if I can find it, it's chapter 30. If any of you got as far as chapter 30. Yes. This is a very practical advice about how he should go about dealing with converting the pagans and what to do in this process and how to do it and so on. He says, okay, have come, where am I, to the conclusion that the temples of idols amongst the people, so the pagan temples, should on no account be destroyed. So if they've got some kind of a temple where they're worshipping their pagan gods, don't just go and knock this down. Okay? The idols should be destroyed, but the temples themselves are to be aspersed with holy water, and then altars are set up in them and relics deposited here. So, we keep the building, we destroy and remove the whatever idols, whatever images and things the pagans are worshipping in their temple. Then you sprinkle holy water to purify the building. Then you build an altar inside it, and you bring in the relics, holy relics, remains of saints or whatever. For if these temples are well built, They must be purified from the worship of demons and dedicated to the service of the true God. In this way, we hope the people, seeing that their temples are not destroyed, may abandon their error, stop being pagan, and flocking more readily to their accustomed resorts, may come to know and adore the true God. And he goes on, making the similar kind of point in various other ways. But what he's saying here is what? What's the sort of main message, practical message to Augustine and the other missionaries who are faced with hundreds of miles of pagans, in effect? They're just sitting there on the edge of Kent, in Canterbury, and their job is essentially to begin the process of conversion. So they're in a pretty restricted and nasty position. So what's he saying?
Basically be nice to them, but like do the conversion in I mean, like by not destroying the temples, like obviously they're still getting rid of their idols and converting it, but he's saying don't do it in a hostile way.
Right. And the word accustomed, perhaps, was one of the important words here that I read. I don't know what it's got in your translation. If you're accustomed, the accustomed resorts, the places they're accustomed to going. What's the point here? Okay, we want to take these people, all of you, and we want to convert you from paganism, you're the worshippers of David or something like that, or the god, and we want to convert you to Christianity, okay? And every week or every day or something, you all gather in this room and worship me, okay? And what he's saying is, don't just destroy the whole building, because then that's a massive, significant break. It's a black and white line in their lives, okay? Provide some kind of continuity, something that they're used to. Make it a bit easier for them, okay? So remove the idols, remove the things that they are used to worshipping in the temple. I don't know, David's books and his acetate things or whatever, and put in a cross and an altar and so on, but use the same building. Then they're used to coming here and being religious. Just show them that they've got to be religious in a different way, the correct way, in the same building. And he makes a few other similar points, okay? That we can't, it's impossible, he says, to change people's lifestyle completely overnight. We have to do it gradually and so on. This is a very practical piece of advice. And of course, many of the famous converts to Christianity, including the Emperor Constantine, okay, we would kind of question, in our modern kind of perspective, modern Christian perspective, you might question their motives. These people said, I'll become, and he's not the only one, I'll become a Christian if I'm victorious in battle. And most Christians today would say, well, that's not really what Christianity is about, saying, I'll win a battle, then I'll worship your God. It's a very pagan kind of attitude, or it's not uncommon amongst the pagans. So again, you see, it's not a black and white thing. People are shifting to the religion, but often for more pagan reasons and things like that. So this is what he's advising there. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. I just want to make a few other very brief points, okay? We talked about Bertha and Athelbert. We mentioned them down there in Kent. Again, last week, Athelbert's daughter, Athelber, was married, or became married to whom? Do you remember from last week? Edwin, Yadwinner. Edwin, who was from Deira but ruling what's becoming Northumbria for a while and so on. He converted to Christianity. He's one of the big things for the introduction, one of the big figures of the introduction of Christianity into amongst the Northern English. Okay, and again, he's married to a Christian wife. He's one who goes through a number of stages. The story here, two kind of stages. She gets married to him, okay, and is accompanied by one of Gregory's missionaries called Paulinus, a bishop. And he has some discussions amongst them and things like that. He's aware of their religious perspectives and so on. One day there is an attempt to assassinate Edwin by some people sent from Wessex, okay, for political reasons amongst others. And on the same day, I think, Athelber gives birth to their daughter, Eanflide. And he says, I'm going to fight the West Saxons, and if I win, I'll think about becoming Christian, the things we were saying before, okay, similar. And he does win, but then he doesn't convert immediately, but then he remembers a vision of God he had when he was an exile from Northumbria amongst the East Angles, and it's a various kind of slower process for him, but he eventually converts. Then he works very closely with Paulinus, trying to encourage Christianity. And we can look at smaller stories of other individual kingdoms that are converted to Christianity at various points. We have accounts of some of these in Bede. In some cases, a guy converts, but then his son or successor, whoever it is after him, who perhaps hadn't converted or goes back to being a pagan. So it doesn't happen immediately overnight. You get a conversion and then everyone becomes Christian because of the king. Sometimes paganism has a brief kind of reassertion for a generation or so afterwards, and then gradually we have the spread. Okay, so from small beginnings in Kent, we get the connection in Northumbria. We have connections in East Anglia there as well. I mentioned last time that also from the Kentish line we have the connection with Wulfhere, one of the rulers of Mercia, who also a big kingdom in the middle there. So we get the gradual spread during the, well, from the late 6th, 7th, and into the early 8th century. We can trace the spread of Christianity, but primarily it's a 7th century process. Okay, we'll stop there because we run out of time. But there are plenty of things we could have said more. We might pick up on some of these ideas when we also look at, starting on Thursday, looking at the history, early history of Ireland during this period. We can see some similarities. We'll also look at the politics, and we'll look at the religious side of Irish history during the pre-Viking period as well. So I have a bibliography for you all. Quick question.
29, it says Pope sent some epistles and several ministers to Augustine. This city granted him Paul, P-A-L-L.
That's a symbol of office, of being, of being the bishop. It's a symbol to reflect. So it's a way of saying you have episcopal status or something like that. Pallium in Latin. Okay, for next time then, on Thursday, we have presentation from Fatty about early Irish politics. He and I will be discussing this tomorrow, so we know what we're doing. In a week's time, I'll give you 7 days. Do your best to read the religious legal text known as Cain Adovnan. And again, it's from Paul Halsel's Fordham medieval sourcebook site. And in addition to the political stuff, we'll also talk about the arrival of Christianity and spread of Christianity in Ireland during the post-Roman period as well. Okay, see you all on Thursday. Thank you very much. Okay, let's make a start, because with 1 hour, or 50 minutes, of course, we have limited time, and we've got 2 things to do today. Firstly, I want to finish our very brief survey of the politics of pre-Viking Britain, with reference to kind of very northern England and what is now Scotland, and say a little bit about what was going on there very, very briefly. You could run a whole course on each of these areas, of course, so we're touching upon these things very, very basically. And then, I hope, you have all read those chapters from the first book of Bede's Ecclesiastical History, and we'll chat a little bit about those, particularly with reference to the process of conversion of the pagan Anglo-Saxons, or that refers particularly to the conversion of Athelbert in Kent, of course, but we can get some other points from there as well, I hope. Right, so what is now called Scotland? What's the Turkish again? Iskocia, okay, which is kind of roughly north of here. We can only really begin referring to the concept of Scotland as such by the 10th century. Before that, we have a series of shifting and fluctuating kingdoms and peoples, okay, and only in the 10th century and later can we really accurately say this is Scotland, okay, or as it's sometimes called, Alba or Albu and so on, as a sort of separate and fairly fixed entity. Firstly, a few words about the element Scot, because that's confusing. The name Scotland means the land of the Scots, of course, but the Scots originally came from Ireland. Scotti, the Scots in medieval Latin, was a word used to refer to, one of the words used to refer to the Irish, okay? And as we're going to see briefly today and hopefully a bit more later on in a few weeks' time, at some point in the very late Roman period or whatever, or perhaps earlier, people argue these things, some people from Ireland, from this region called Ulster in the north, had settled in the Scottish Isles round here, and it's during the early Middle Ages that the gradual spread of this kingdom to the creation in the 10th century of the kingdom of the Scots happens, okay? So not only, bless you, Chucky Ash, that was a loud one, we probably picked it up on the microphone then. Only with the spread of the power of these Irish immigrants politically do we get the concept of Scotland correctly, of course. We can refer to geographically what's now Scotland, as I keep saying, but originally this area was the land of the Scots, and then slowly they expand at the expense of the Picts and the Dalriatans and others, and then in the 10th century we get something which we can properly call Scotland as a separate kingdom or whatever. So there's a certain level of confusion. We get that in the sources. When we see Scot or something, does it mean an Irish person, or does it mean someone from what is or becomes Scotland? So there's a certain amount of confusion about that. Of course, just to remind ourselves, during the Roman period, Scotland and part of northern England as well was not under direct Roman influence. We have the governor Agricola having some success in the north of Scotland, but that was very, very short-lived. And then we have, of course, Hadrian's Wall, and briefly a bit later Antonine Wall, but going back to Hadrian's Wall as we've discussed before, as the effective border between Britain, Roman Britain, and non-Roman Britain in the north. So in terms of looking at Scotland is a continuity, of course. The Roman aspect provides a kind of breaking point in that sense. But gradually, in the post-Roman period, we see the incorporation of what is now Scotland into the broader Christian and post-Roman cultural world, which becomes Britain. I've got two maps here to show the main divisions that we're going to be looking at. Okay, this is very northern England and southern Scotland. Here we see the two walls marked as well for convenience purposes. So what we might call here southern Scotland, between the two walls, okay, has two main linguistic divisions in terms of the political entities. We've already seen that what had probably been a British kingdom, Bernicia, has become controlled from Bamborough by the arriving Angles, and that history of that area is tied in with Deira. We talked about that last time, and much of the post-Roman period we see the gradual expansion of these Northumbrian regions this way and that way. Okay. In addition to these English kingdoms, however, also in the north, as these had been originally, we see British or Brittonic kingdoms. So firstly the English ones, and we've talked about that already, and now we'll say a little bit about some of these British kingdoms as well. A number of kingdoms seem to emerge in the post-Roman period, again, just as we see elsewhere, as a localization of culture and politics and so on. Okay.